So this episode is going to kind of predominantly be around high intensity PEMF, and for listeners that have only just tuned in and maybe this is their first episode, can you give what an experience of high intensity PEMF actually feels like and what makes it different than a stereotypical lower intensity system?
Sure. So high intensity, um, I would suggest is somewhat personal. High intensity is the amount of magnetic energy that a system does put out, but people do respond to it differently. We have uh, football players that weigh over 300 pounds that as we turn the intensity on our system up, will say, that's enough at a different power level or intensity level than maybe someone that weighs 125 pounds. So
Mm.
people do respond to the intensity differently. The pulse system allows you to increase in intensity from very low, where you feel nothing, to a point where you start to feel a tingling, to a place where you will get significant involuntary muscle response, primarily with the larger muscle groups. And that is what I think you generally would categorize as what it feels like. You do get that high intensity. Uh, the muscle movement is something that is common, again, with the larger muscles. What we do find is that if you do have some areas where you've got inflammation, possibly, the magnetic signal doesn't travel through that tissue or those cells the same way it does a normal, healthy cell. And sometimes people will feel more intensity in a certain spot. It's very common for people to ask the question if they're sitting in a chair that we produce where the magnetic signal is coming out in both shoulders, and as an example, they'll actually point to one and say, how did it know that this is where I have an injury? And of course it doesn't, but the magnetic signal will actually feel different going through and past those types of cells.
Yeah, and I think that's great because a lot of people are actually using high intensity devices almost as a diagnostic tool. Obviously, we can't call it that, and we have to be careful with claims we make. But you can almost wave the paddle around the body and find where the problematic areas are, and it may not necessarily be where the pain is from a day-to-day perspective, but there might be something else that's giving misalignment. So it's quite a nice little area that the devices are being used.
And we sometimes refer to that as hotspots.
Okay.
What is interesting, Andy, is we sometimes will find that if we have the system set to turn the magnet on and off 5 times every second, or the frequency 5 times the pulse rate, and we're doing that type of movement of our paddles on someone's back, as an example, they may not feel something, but if we turn the setting to 2.5 pulses per second, they actually may. So there is
Mm.
some difference, as you asked earlier, if there's a difference even with high intensity, if the frequency does matter, and it certainly may.
Okay, so that's another area where it's quite important. Do you mentioned about muscle contractions and it's easier to, show in a video of like people almost convulsing, do you know what's happening inside the body to create that muscle contraction?
Yes. So the magnetic field, as the magnet gets turned on, if you could imagine, I'm in the pulse chair. If this was what I was sitting on, the magnetic field would be coming out from behind me. That magnetic field, every time it gets turned on, leaves the pad and travels through my body. As it does, it's passing by and through my cells. And a little bit of that magnetic energy is interacting with the cell membrane itself. And through induction, some of that energy is actually transferring to the cell. And that is stimulating a response, in particular with fast twitch muscles. So it's actually causing that muscle that's down to the cellular level to actually fire, and it's twitching. And that
Mm.
is what's leading to that contraction.
No, nice. And ATP is something that's mentioned quite a lot when it comes to PMF therapy. Are you able to just give a really quick explanation of, first of all, what ATP is, and then why it's such an important part of the conversation when we're talking about PEMF?
So ATP, I would say, is uh, the ultimate fuel that PEMF is certainly beneficial in aiding with. So adenosine triphosphate, ATP, I think is best described as the body's electrical power at the cell level. And if you consider the average person is made up of 30 trillion cells, kind of hard to get our heads around something like that. But 30 trillion cells, every cell has a function, including a bone cell, right? We think of bones as just something that is there, but it's actually metabolically active. A bone cell needs power. And if we consider every cell as a factory, the factory takes input, raw materials. It uses energy to convert those raw materials into an output product. Our cells are just like that. So oxygen, hydration, nutrients must come into a cell, and that cell needs power to convert those raw inputs into the necessary things that allow that cell to function. So if it's a liver cell or a bone cell or a red blood cell, something happens within that cell to make it produce what a kidney does or a liver does or a red blood cell does. It does need power, and that power is ATP. Often people today are hearing more and more about mitochondria. Mitochondria is certainly critical to the production of ATP, but ultimately ATP is what, much like your cell phone battery does, it allows that cell to function, and if it can function, it can actually bring those nutrients in. And what that really does mean is that our cells are protected by a membrane or a cell wall. And those membranes are there to keep the cell intact, all of the things within the cell, the organelle in the cell, but it protects the cell. But that barrier, that membrane, actually can restrict nutrients and other things from being brought through the cell membrane. The same way as the cell does its function, it takes that raw material and it uses it, it produces waste product. If the cell does not have the proper electrical charge, it can't push the waste product out of the cell and bring nutrients, fresh nutrients in. ATP is one of those things that allows that to happen.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great answer, and it's a good way. It's just explaining to people that PEMF therapy isn't healing; it's creating the environment in the body to heal. It's giving you the
Exactly.
ATP. It's doing, it's giving you all the tools you need to do that healing. And I know this is, from experience, it's a difficult question to answer a lot of the time. But how quickly can people typically expect to notice pain relief when it comes to high intensity PEMF?
That is one difference I think that high intensity does offer. We will find that people will feel a difference in the first session. And that could be as short as 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We prefer that people use it longer, but because high intensity does bringing a lot of energy, people will feel something, not only pain relief, but they'll often feel a difference in range of motion potential in a single session. Now, the benefits certainly will be limited as the body absorbs that energy, and the pain or limited range of motion comes from some other injury. We're not suggesting that PEMF solves any of those things immediately. It generally doesn't. But the pain relief for pain management purposes and so forth, you can feel in a single session. Generally, what we believe and what we've seen is that, as the PEMF does its work, it's going to raise the electrical potential of the cell membrane. Generally, if the body has the right nutrients, in particular mineral content, that cell will stay electrically charged at that higher level for up to 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've also found is that you can't overcharge a cell.
Mm.
So if a cell has the right electrical potential, that magnetic signal is going to just pass right through, much like your cell phone. If you charge it and you keep it plugged in, it does not damage the battery. PEMF is very similar to that with the cells.
Yeah, and great answer there. And a couple of things I just wanted to summarize with, the difference between high and low intensity. I reflect that completely the same in terms of both of them are there to get to the same outcome of fixing the problem and reducing the pain. But high intensity seems to just have this immediate analgesic effect on top, the little cherry on top. That's quite a nice little addition that kind of helps to switch off the pain almost immediately for a certain amount of period of time. So that's a nice little thing. And also, you mentioned the dose effect, which we spoke of on the podcast a few times before. When you talk about red light therapy, there is a dose effect where you can actually do too much. So you have to find that sweet spot. But with PEMF therapy, you can't overdo it, but sometimes it's just not necessary to do it for such a long time. So two little bits in there, which are great little nuggets. I just wanted to kind of summarize those. But a question we hear quite often, and I want to get your spin on this, is when is the best time of day to use high intensity PEMF? Maybe we summarize this a little bit in the quickfire question, but if you could only use a pulse once per day, when would you use it? When would you recommend?
I think if the answer that I'll give you is more focused on high intensity, the use of the high intensity, I would say early in the day is probably good. You've just woken up and you're going to start your day. You're going to start putting stress on the body. You're going to start to stress those same down to the cellular level parts of the body. Putting that high intensity in, if you only had one time a day to do it in the morning, would give you some of that foundation to actually set yourself up properly or best for that day.